I found that teaching itself to be one of the most rewarding things I could do. Helping a new generation of young adults to form their lives, you're helping them build something of themselves, and you're contributing to a brighter future ahead of time. So it's an extremely rewarding profession, as I've found. I wouldn't exchange it for anything in the world.
Hello, my name is Timothy Bushunow, and I'm excited to be hosting today's episode of Tea Time at the Seminary, a show where we have conversations with Orthodox Christians all while drinking our favorite cup of tea. I'm here at St. Photios Orthodox Theological Seminary in Etna, California, and today we are joined by one of our lecturers who has taught classes such as art history and bioethics. He has been a very well-received instructor at our seminary and will be helping teach our Pastoral Psychology class for the 2022 Nativity term. I would like to introduce you all to Mr. Mateusz Ferens. Thank you for joining us today.
I'm very glad to be here.
Now, in case you didn't know, we also call him Matt because Mateusz actually means Matthew in English.
That's right.
So, Matt, first question, and it's always the most difficult question on this show. What kind of tea flavor would you like to drink? Next to you, we have black tea. In the middle, we have licorice spice. And next to me, we have strawberry pomegranate. Which one would you like to drink?
I think black tea.
Black tea. And is there a particular reason you chose black tea?
There is not. It's the closest one to me.
It's the closest one to you, and therefore it is the one you chose.
That is the one I chose.
All right. I'm going to ask you the first question of the day, and that question is, how and why did you become a teacher?
Well, I think why is because of necessity, but how is a bit of a longer story. I had a lot of experience with my dad, who was teaching us at home. My mom was also teaching us at home for a while, so I was homeschooled. And so I got to see my parents teach me, and at some points I even kind of took over and as the older brother taught my sisters and really kind of got into that role of showing how to do certain math problems, and eventually just kind of became natural, but I think not easy at all. And one of the, it takes a long time to gain experience in something, and certainly that's the case with teaching. And it takes a lot of making mistakes and a lot of building of that kind of experience. So my first teaching attempt was an absolute disaster, I'm very happy to say. And so I learned a lot from it. And it was one of those things that I was teaching a painting class, and it was an acrylic painting class. And overall, I think I came very prepared. I did all the right things, but I realized that the timing of it, we only had 3 hours, and the students had to paint an entire painting. And so even though that's something I could do within that time allotment, certainly the students needed more help. And towards the end, I needed to kind of help them fix some stuff on their paintings. And well, so it was one of those things that I walked away having learned a lot from the first try. I didn't get to teach really until graduate school, and that was as a teaching assistant for an art history class, which was a wonderful experience. And I remember the first time that I walked into a classroom, I had 3 classes in a row. So it was 3 hours, and by the third class, I have absolutely forgotten what I had covered and what I hadn't covered. So I was asking the students, wait, did we cover this before? And they said like, oh, no, that's still new to us. Of course, I had to adjust. But then I had some students who had questions for me after class. They stopped by, about assignments, and when they left, I packed up my things, I locked the door, and thought to myself, gosh, this is something that I really want to do for the rest of my life. So it hit me right away. And ever since then, I've been inclined to be a teacher. So I've found that teaching itself to be one of the most rewarding things I could do, partly because in in these moments that happen occasionally, they don't happen all the time, but once in a while, you will see in a student genuine growth. And this growth sometimes can be an expression of face. You can see that somebody has really gotten the material. It somehow clicks. And that's the expression that often people use, and you really get to see that. And you get a sense that you as a teacher are doing something productive in the world. But productive in the sense that you're helping a new generation of young adults to form their lives. You're helping them build something of themselves, and you're contributing to a brighter future ahead of time. So it's an extremely rewarding profession, as I've found, and I wouldn't exchange it for anything in the world.
And what is one of your favorite classes to teach at the seminary?
Well, I started off teaching Byzantine art, the history of Byzantine art, and I've always had an affinity for that class, but I've developed it since into other classes. For example, the first time that I taught it, I taught 2 semesters, and the 2 semesters were a sequence of Byzantine art, and then especially how Byzantine art and architecture fit into the, I suppose, to the broader cultural sphere, the Muslim world, the Western culture. And so aside from looking at Byzantine art and architecture, we also looked at Gothic cathedrals, mosques, all the way through to essentially the post-Byzantine period.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about your approach. You talked a little bit about it earlier. So what is your teaching style? Because so many people have different types of ways that they learn. Some people are auditory learners, some people are visual learners. How do you adhere to all of those people in your classes?
Yeah, well, the students are part of the equation, certainly. And then the teaching style, I think, must fit the professor or the teacher. And it also has to fit the subject and also the environment. So all these components, they factor into a teaching style. My own teaching style developed a little bit more from an attempt to understand what it is that the students need, especially on our day-to-day. Students come from all kinds of backgrounds, and they also come from a certain educational, experience, I would say. That has to be taken into account. And so I have a different teaching style when I'm teaching a master's level course, so more advanced, it's a graduate course, versus an undergraduate course. And the teaching style that I've adopted was really born out of looking at the written work of those teachers who have been really recognized as effective teachers. Now, one of those people is John Taylor Gatto. Now, he taught in New York State. He was awarded multiple times for his teaching. He taught, he didn't teach college level, he taught high school and lower level. But he noticed something very important about teaching, and the way he expressed it best, I think, is that teaching is not like the art of painting. The art of painting, really, you add colors, you add paint to a canvas. He compared teaching, effective teaching, to the work of a sculptor. And that really puzzled me, especially, well, I understand the work of a sculptor, and it's really kind of taking material away and not really adding anything. And I thought that was really strange as an analogy, as a metaphor for teaching, because, well, how does one teach material, especially if I want to convey to students, let's say, a certain knowledge? How is it that I work as a sculptor? And I realized that, and I'm still working on this kind of methodology or approach to teaching, but it's really about sharpening in students that which they already come to class with. And I started to think about my students as people who have a certain kind of experience, who are also engaged with things that are going on in our world politically, culturally. They have a certain amount of films that I've seen. They have a certain amount of worry about what is going on in the world. They come with all that to the class. One of the ways that I've developed is one of the classes that I teach is to really address those issues, to take students and try to explain. It's an element of the film theory that has come about. This is just an example, but it's come about through the hero's arc, for example, or it's sometimes called the hero's journey. It was something that George Lucas used in his movies, and essentially all of our myths take on that model. And that model really is a certain example or a certain metaphor of life. The idea is that somebody goes out, has a call to adventure, and then, has to go through a certain threshold and meets some helpers, some deterrents. Eventually, the hero has to meet the enemy, and the enemy is always part of themselves. That's to say, the dragon, the metaphorical dragon, is always part of ourselves. And this hero's journey, the hero eventually needs to die, and the idea is even a metaphorical death needs to occur, because in order for us to leave who we were and transition, so to speak, into being other people, it requires a certain kind of death. Now, this is an example of something that I've learned to teach, because not only do we get to see that in movies and our stories that we tell our children from essentially the moment that we start reading to them to the movies that we see in cinema today, that really sharpens a student's understanding in that which they already encounter in the world. And it's extremely powerful. I've had students after that particular lesson about the hero's journey, I've had students come up to me afterward and say, I can't think about movies in any other way than to recognize in it elements of the hero's arc, the hero's journey. And that's extremely gratifying for me, because they get to analyze movies, but the movies become so much more meaningful for them. And that's just an example of movies. There are other examples as well. I realized that a lot of our hopes and dreams are built on utopic vision. So I created a lesson on utopia and also dystopia, because that's what drives our fears and also our motivations. And in utopia, as I learned for myself, which was one of the greatest things about being a teacher, is that you do a lot of learning yourself. I've learned that utopia and dystopia are not so much destinations as they are methodologies of navigating our world, especially our political world. And so conveying those kinds of aspects to student is not just rewarding for myself, but it really helps students sharpen those things that they're already encountering in the world. And I use all kinds of examples. I use examples from history. I use examples from mythology. So I go all the way back to the ancient world. A lot of these classes are so comprehensive that they are able to grow roots, so to speak, in deep history and see how those things connect to them. It's really about taking what students already have and showing to them how valuable whatever it is that they have already encountered in the world, how to understand it better. And it's especially important when talking then about more serious things, about like trauma, wounds that have been making monsters out of our cultural opponents, political opponents, and so on and so forth. So that has been my own journey, I suppose, my own kind of ongoing journey. And I've learned from John Taylor Gatto's example that teaching is really about the student and not about the material, certainly not about myself and what I bring to the table. It's about what they bring to the table and exploring that area more. That's ever since been my method of teaching. At least that's what I aspire to when I teach. It doesn't always work, and sometimes I do need to convey to students some material that they're really expecting me to teach, but it's always done with that perspective in keeping in mind what it is that the student comes with. So that's been my methodology, and I found it extremely rewarding. Certainly it's very effective. Well, it's great. It's a classical black tea, and almost like a Ceylon tea because it has a little bit of an extra, like a floral flavor. So that's
Oh, well, I'm glad you like it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, something that might be very difficult being a teacher is that you sometimes have very hard questions that you have to answer. And actually, you just kind of mentioned how there are challenges to being a teacher as well as having rewards. But what is the most challenging question, or one of the most challenging questions a student has ever given to you?
Well, I'm inclined to say that any question that I don't know the answer offhand is a challenging question, but that's not really true because what ends up happening is I just tell the student I'll look into it a little bit more, and then that gives us an opportunity to meet up later. I remember there was a class that I wanted the students to explore a little bit more of their own interests, and one of my students picked Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, and there's a section in that book in which one of the brothers, Ivan, presents this story about the Inquisitor and Christ. It's a famous story, so a lot of people know it, whoever has read the entire book, but also sometimes people who haven't read the book.
I know many people who have just read that chapter.
Just that chapter. Yeah. It's a very significant chapter, and this student was especially interested in archetypes, and that to me seemed very interesting, although to extract a kind of analysis of archetypes from that story, I think was a challenge. Certainly for myself, for that student, I think it would have been a challenge for anybody, even somebody who works with literature. But it was a very interesting proposition. And I remember in class, we were talking about it and really kind of hitting a wall. And so that was very difficult, and I almost was at the point that I had wanted to suggest a different story or something else to focus on. But it occurred to me that we should perhaps do a walkthrough of the story, retell it in our own words, and see what really is going on. And in retelling that story, I think that some of the auxiliary elements of the story were kind of bypassed, and we really were able to bring the story down to its essential components. What are the temptations? What does Christ do? And towards the end of that story, Christ doesn't really have an answer to these temptations that the Inquisitor launches at him, these kinds of accusations, but only kind of kisses the Inquisitor on the cheek, the kiss of love, I suppose. And that's his answer. And we were so focused on the story that I realized that that's not it. And there's the second part of the story, which is what Alyosha does to his brother, which is that he kisses his brother on the cheek. And in the story, now this becomes a meta story because the story is the one that his brother told him. Ivan told his brother Alyosha, and Alyosha kisses his brother, and his brother even is taken aback, says, "Well, that's plagiarism," and it's kind of like this funny thing. But I asked the student at that point, "What did Alyosha do?" And after a little bit of a back and forth with the students, there was this kind of moment of realization that Alyosha follows the archetype. And that is the answer. That's to say, a whole lot of accusations get launched at us throughout our lives. A whole lot is wrong with the world. And the answer to that can be confusing. And then the story is painted as extremely simple. Just follow the archetype being Christ. And with that realization, I mean, I remember the students' reaction. It was absolutely great to see everybody in the class really had this moment of relief in a certain sense. It all came to a beautiful conclusion. And I remember really feeling rewarded as a teacher then because I almost gave up on that story. But it took that work of breaking down into components, doing the work, very careful work together with the students. They were participating throughout. It's almost like we took a a model of a building, and we disassembled it to see how the architecture is really built. And when everything clicked into place and we were able to take our hands off and it stood. And it was that kind of a feeling that, oh, it works and it's brilliant and it's a beautiful story. I think we realized something about it that very few people, I've never heard that interpretation used. And there was an element of discovery. And so I suppose that was a very difficult question to answer. It's certainly one of the most difficult questions that I had to deal with in class. And well, I suppose it was intuition on the one hand, but it was the participation of the students that helped us get to that moment.
All right, so we had tea, but now it is snack time. All right, Matt, we have 3 snacks right in front of you, and you can choose which one you'd like to eat. Next to you, we have chocolate chips. In the middle, we have granola. And next to me, we have almonds. Which one would you like to eat?
I think I'll go with the chocolate chips. And this time, definitely not because it's closest to me, because they're just really good.
Chocolate chips are delicious. Very good choice. All right, so Matt, while you're nibbling on your chocolate chips, I'm going to ask you the next question. Do you believe that students in the modern age, or just people in the modern age, are not as smart as they used to be?
Oh, I don't know how to answer that question, but I do know that students today face challenges that nobody has yet had to face. In terms of especially distractions, the student body in today's world is changing. This is something that's been really pointed out by somebody who I really admire for their teaching abilities. That's Michael Wesch in Kansas. I believe Kansas University, University of Kansas. I always get those mixed up. But Michael Wesch is somebody from whom I have taken a lot of cues on about teaching. He points out that especially young adults, they need to understand why. They need to have that answered for them in order to take really anything seriously. A lot of the assumptions that especially college professors have is that if you're in a class, you understand that this is somehow valuable to you. That is in today's age, that is too much of an assumption. As a teacher, in today's classroom, you really need to let your students know what the value of a subject is. And so there's a kind of a bit of a crisis of significance of really how significant is something for me. Our world today is moving very fast, and students are aware of it because they have just come out of high school, where not only has high school transitioned really quickly, but the technologies have changed while they were there, right? And a lot of students are very aware that whatever it is that they're being taught right now is not doing anything to prepare them ultimately for whatever job or career that they will have. And the career that they will have or job that they will have, let's say in 5 years, 4 years, whenever they graduate, is likely not even on the market at the moment. It will have to be created somehow, right? So how do you prepare a student for something that doesn't even exist yet? And well, that's a tough question, but of course the students are aware of it. And they find themselves in a kind of a limbo, in a kind of no man's land, so to speak, when it comes to education. Why is it that they need to take a class like history, or even further than history, art history? Why not just go right into the practical things? If they want to become a designer, why not just begin drawing and their CAD programs, the computer animated design, all those kinds of things right away? Today's generation has a problem with significance, crisis of meaning, and I think that a lot of times this crisis of meaning and significance is interpreted or misinterpreted by teachers as sometimes as a lack of interest, which that can be true, but the lack of interest as there's something behind it. There's a reason why students aren't interested in a particular subject. It has to be generated, and teachers find themselves doing the dual work of not just teaching the material, but also trying to generate excitement about the material and significance in the students, which really never has been the role of a teacher. The students should really come to class already having that sense of that they want to be here, right? And the other thing too is that teachers nowadays, so they misinterpret that as, I think, this lack of excitement as certain inabilities and lack of background. Our students come out of high schools very poorly prepared to face the world, and that is a very kind of complicated. It's a very complicated and complex situation with our current educational system at that pre-secondary level. And so does that mean that the students are less smart? I think I can be quite certain that they are more distracted in today's world. I can be certain that they face problems that students of previous generations had not faced. I'll just give you an example. There are now kids from middle school who come back home worried about global warming and that the world is going to collapse, imminently. And, when you think a few generations back, these kids were coming back home from school worried about if they're going to win their next soccer game, or about their artwork or their project or whatever it is. The students right now are given existential problems to bear on their shoulders. It's a good cause to care about the earth, but it's far too heavy of a burden to put on a kid's shoulders. And high schoolers, you can just imagine what that carries through by the time that these students come to high school. Who are these students who are coming into classrooms, in our classrooms? They are people who have a lot of wounds that they carry with them, a lot of holes that have been bored into them through experiences, something that I can associate essentially with trauma in the end. But it's a kind of a trauma. It's not. Sometimes it is indeed events that have happened to these young people, but more so it's a kind of a cultural attitude that has induced into them and certain kinds of self-accepted damages. One class that I taught about the hero's arc that ended there was a 5-week section of the class. I divided that whole class, the whole course, into 3 sections, each about 5 weeks. And we had just come to the end of the first section of the class. And I asked the students to submit an assignment in which they think of their life as this hero's journey. What is the most significant element in their life that they had to battle? And this is the battle within themselves, right? So what dragon or what monster, the proverbial dragon, right, this metaphorical dragon that they had to face. And these students have written essays in which they describe some of their deepest traumas. I mean, sometimes abuse, and they were very open about it. I didn't ask them to include those kinds of details. Sometimes most students wrote way more than I asked them for in terms of limit. It was an essay in which they explored themselves at the deepest level. Those essays, at least half of them, I couldn't read 2 of them in a row. I really, my compassion for them grew at that moment and grew to a level that I'm still trying to deal with, right? And it's not excusing. Psychology is not excusology, But at the same time, I realized that I'm dealing with people who themselves are dealing with terrible, terrible consequences of things that they're way beyond their control. I've read a section from Man's Search for Meaning, that book, which is an excellent book. written by somebody who has survived a Holocaust, the Holocaust, and survived a concentration camp, who was a psychologist there in the concentration camp, and wrote that book. And my last class was about hope, right? And so I read sections of that book for my class, and I read sections from it, and some of the sentences I repeated for my class, and in the end, I kind of gave students a philosophy of hope. The idea is that hope is a dangerous thing, dangerous in the sense that when hope is not met, when you do survive, let's say, a concentration camp, and you're hoping that your family is alive, and you've finally gotten out of this terrible place, only to find that nobody that you knew has survived the war, right? That hope to see them again can become a terrible enemy. But we cannot function without hope. To lose hope means essentially the end of the road. And so it's a two-edged sword. And so I presented a philosophy of hope to the students. And one of the last things that I did for them is I played a video of, it was a very simple thing, people boarding a commuter train somewhere in Europe, and just somebody had a little ukulele, and they played Somewhere Over the Rainbow. And they got the entire train cars to start singing with them. And everybody was smiling and laughing, and people were singing. And I really wanted to leave students not just on a good note, but show them how little it takes to change people's lives, right? You start by changing somebody's day, by changing a frown into a smile, right? That's all it takes to change the world. And I remember I had a student who wrote to me an email after that class, and she said that she went home and cried. And it was really touching, because there were moments in that class that I wanted to cry too, especially with reading the really with reading that particular book, which is very touching. And she told me, then she wrote in that email how as the class culminated in this topic on hope, it opened up for her the ability to see her own trauma and to move past it. And I never thought of a class. So, it's a class in college, right? When we're not talking about, this isn't therapy, this isn't going to a counselor, this isn't going to a priest for confession or anything like that. But just that, I remember when I started off talking about my methodology and approach to classes, how it's really sharpening an understanding of oneself that the classes aim for. That was enough to move that person from being stuck somewhere in their internal labyrinth, right? And to finally escape it. And the escape from the labyrinth is never complete, and I understand that, because it's an escape from one labyrinth and you are immediately launched into another one, but one in which you are more capable of solving the problem yourself and moving on to other and bigger labyrinths, and being able to take on more and more with your life. So the feeling of being unstuck, the way she conveyed to me in that email, it was something very profound, something I know that I'll carry on with my heart for as long as I live. If somebody is having a conversation with me and they're really pouring out something that has happened to them or some life experience, I will sit and listen, because that moment can be much more important than for me to get to wherever else that I'm getting, for shopping, whatever all the necessities of life demand of me. Human connection is so far, we don't have that anymore in our societies, that it cannot ever be neglected. We have to give our time and effort to listen to people who need to be listened to. We need to do the work of giving them the tools that they need to survive in today's world. And that's as much as we can do. That's our obligation.
All right, that's it for Tea Time at the Seminary. Thank you so much for watching. We talked a little bit about teaching today, and now I'm going to teach you how to subscribe to our channel. All you have to do is press the subscribe button. We'd really appreciate it here at St. Photios Orthodox Theological Seminary.
Cheers.